Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the second of our PPSR webinar series. Wanted to quickly introduce myself. My name is Paul Mead and I'm the PPSR Specialist here at CreditorWatch. And I'm joined once again by Terry Ledlin from Ledlin Lawyers.
Morning, Paul.
So yes, thanks again for joining us. And thank you for your questions from our last webinar. My apologies again that we ran out of time to answer them. However, they've all been addressed separately. And if you require any further information, then please just let me know. We will take questions again today. We may not have time given we do have a lot of material to cover off again. So if we don't have a chance, we will get back to your questions individually in the next day or so.
Okay. So, Paul, today we're going to cover a few things. According to the schedule, we're going to have a recap of the last webinar. We're going to look at how to register on the register. We're going to look at some common mistakes. We're also going to have a look at what you need to do for this January 2019 deadline that's coming up. And lastly, we're going to have a look at how changing your terms can affect your PPSA registrations.
Fantastic. Look, Terry, here's just a little bit about CreditorWatch and Ledlin's Lawyers for everyone who may not be a current customer of CreditorWatch or Ledlin's.
And of course, here's a little photograph of us. As you can see, we've both got faces for radio. And of course, as I always point out, please no para-jokes.
Fantastic. Look, let's do a brief recap of our last webinar, Terry.
Okay. So, briefly, let's talk about the Act. The Act came into effect in January 2012, and it provides a regime where security interests in personal property, that's personal property, not land, are given priority over other competing interests. So the Act requires that you understand the distinction between real estate and personal property. Real estate, of course, we all know what that means. That's land. That includes anything that's affixed to the land, like a house or building. Personal property, of course, is, generally speaking, everything else. So that can be goods, it can be cars, it could be boats, it could be jewellery, it could be shares in companies, anything of a personal nature. The other thing we looked at last time was security interests. And it's important to bear in mind that security interests are created by a contract. A credit account or a credit application itself does not create a security interest, and the PPSA does not in itself create a security interest. What the PPSA does, it creates a regime for notification of priority of security interests via the register. So the usual security interest that we're going to focus on, and the one that's most common, is what's known as the retention of title, or an ROT. And that's an interest that a seller will retain until payment is made by a customer. Now, there's also, and we'll talk about this later, a specific type of security interest called a PIMSI, Purchase Money Security Interest. And that is the golden goose of security interest. That's the one that gives you a super priority for credit providers. But to get that super priority, you must register as a PIMSI on the register. And of course, we'll look at that a bit later as well. The other thing that we covered last time round was this question of registration. And it's helpful to think of the register as an online notice board. So for those people who search the register and the world generally, you are giving notice to everybody of your security interest. And because it's so important that you give notice, then the Act itself requires that the registration process is very prescriptive. What that means is if you make an error in your registrations, if your registrations are misleading or incorrect, then the registration will be ineffective. And what happens if it's ineffective? Then you're going to lose any sort of priority. So what's this stuff really about with registration? You need to be registered because you can no longer rely on your title or ownership or contract terms. What you need to do is register your security interests so that if there is an insolvency event, in other words, your customer goes broke, you're still going to have some action and your interests are going to be protected. Now, the deal is, of course, that the Act came in 2012, January 2012. We're now approaching that 7 years' time. And that means that registrations that were made for 7 years will expire this January. Okay, so that's the recap. Now, let's just have a quick look.
Terry, can you tell us a bit more about the register itself?
Yeah, okay. So when we talk about registering security interests, that's not quite technically correct. So the Act doesn't provide for security interests to be registered. What it says is you've got to give notice of your security interest. And the way that you do that is by lodging what's known as a financing statement. So it's the financing statement that gets registered, and that gives notice to the world of the existence of your security interest. So tip number one is have a look at your terms and conditions and have a look how your particular PPSA clauses are actually worded around registration. Does it talk about registering a security interest, or does it talk about registering a financing statement? So, secondly, why would you want to register? Well, as I said, to maintain that notice on the board, on the online notice board. But before we really get into the specifics, let's just go back to basics. It's important that the PPS provides strict timeframes for registration, and if you don't comply with that, and you don't comply with those time frames, then that can have serious consequences. So the PPSA priority rules determine which secured party ranks higher. In most cases, an earlier dated registration beats a later one or a later one. Now, if you're taking security interest by a company, in other words, if your customer is a company, then you've got to register your financing statement within 20 days of the security agreement coming into effect. So that's as a result of the section of the Corporations Act 588 FL. If you fail to register within that 20 days, you may lose ownership of your goods if your customer goes into liquidation. There are timeframes particularly for PIMSIs as well. PIMSIs, as we said before, are a type of security interest where you get super priority. And as I said before, we'll look closely at that later, but it's got to be registered within a specific time frame. If the collateral is inventory, then registration must be made on the register prior to the customer taking possession. If the collateral is not inventory, then the registration must be made within 15 business days after the customer takes possession.
So, Terry, what is your recommendation for when your clients should be registering?
Okay. This stuff starts when you enter into an agreement with your customer. So, tip, very simple, register as soon as possible after approving credit or entering into an agreement with your customer. Make it part of your onboarding process. Now, let's talk about registering correctly. The PPSR is highly prescriptive, as we said before, and any errors may leave your registration ineffective and therefore unperfected. So we'll look at some cases a little later where failure to register correctly has had disastrous consequences.
So, Terry, I'm a customer. I believe I'm all set to go and register.
Yep.
What actual things should I have ready before I register?
Well, let's just have a quick look. These are the types of things that you need to register correctly, namely secured party details, that's your details, the grantor details, that's your customer's details, a description of the collateral and proceeds, in other words, a description of what your product is or what you're selling or leasing. You have to have an end time for the registration. You have to indicate whether it's a PIMSI or not. You have to indicate if the collateral is inventory, if the if the security interest is subject to control, and whether or not it is a transitional security interest. So here's another tip. All of that information you would normally get from your credit application. So the idea is that you would review your credit application and how you obtain information about your customers. Because if the information provided in that credit app is wrong, consequently, the registration may be wrong as well. Or this might be where an online credit application with verification can help.
Yeah, Terry, so we have a product called Apply Easy, which is our online application form we provide to a number of clients who use CreditorWatch. The beauty of the product is that many of the details that an end customer would enter through Apply Easy are verified to ensure that their details are correct, potentially with ASIC and director information as well. Look, what we might do now is quickly jump into a poll question, and the poll question is based around duration time. I'll just launch that now for you. What it's asking is, what is the duration time of your registrations? If you can, just jump in there and ask, and let us know if you register for 7 years or less, more than 7 years but less than 25, or you're doing an undefined duration time. We'll just give that a minute to finalise. Okay, fantastic. So we've got quite a good response from that webinar, from the poll question, sorry. And what it stated was that we had 78% of you that were registering for 7 years or less, 8% of you registering for more than 7 years but less than 25, and 14% were actually registering for no stated end time.
Okay, so once we have the information ready and we know how long we want to register, the next step is to actually register. And there are lots of common mistakes when you register. Bear in mind that a registration will be ineffective if it has certain defects. A defect in a registration includes an irregularity, an omission, or an error in registration. The thing to remember is, if registration is ineffective, the security interest is unperfected, although an ineffective registration does not affect the validity of the security agreement that you've entered into.
So, Terry, I know I get asked this a lot, but from your side, what do you see the common mistakes people make when registering?
Okay, so we can break common mistakes into two categories: those that are fatal to your registration and those that are potentially fatal to your registration. So particular fatal defects we've shown on the screen: an error in the grantor's details. Remember, the register is highly prescriptive. You cannot allow misrepresentation. So if you get the grantor's details wrong, then that is in itself a misrepresentation, and that will be a fatal error. You will lose the benefit of your registration. So it's errors in your customer's details that you've put in. If you've got collateral that's got to be described by a serial number, if you've mistranscribed, you've put in a missing serial number or an incorrect serial number, then again, that will be fatal. If you try and register a non-PIMSI and describe it as a PIMSI, that will be fatal. If you incorrectly state that a security interest is transitional when it's not, that will be fatal. And of course, if you pick the wrong collateral class, that too will be fatal. So let's just have a little look at those separately. So we've got grantor details. So you've got to identify the capacity in which the grantor or your customer is holding the collateral and granting the security interest. This usually comes from the information that you gathered from your credit application. But you, as we said before, you've got to make sure it's accurate, because if you don't register against the correct grantor, the registration will be ineffective. Now, the PPSA provides strict identifiers for grantors that must be used. And if we have a look there, you can see some. For an individual, you've got to register against an individual's name and date of birth. For a body corporate, it has to be the company's ACN. There is a separate area if you're dealing with an Australian registered scheme number. We won't go into that detail. But overall, if you're dealing with a company, then it's the ACN. If you're dealing with a trust, it's the ABN, the Australian business number. And if you're dealing with a partnership, then it should be, of course, the ABN of the partnership. So some examples: if you've got an incorrect identifier, that would mean, for example, that you've registered against the ABN instead of the ACN. If you've got an incorrect number, so if the ACN was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and you registered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8, clearly misleading, clearly in trouble. And of course, if you made a spelling mistake in the name of the grantor, so if you put Mikhail, in other words, instead of putting Michael, you put EAL instead of AEL, again, fatal. When it comes to serial numbered goods, here's some rules. Serial numbers must be registered as set out in the registrations. Some things the regs prescribe must be described by serial number. So if it's consumer matters, then it's going to be cars, watercraft, intangible property like trademarks, etc. For commercial matters, it's aircraft and parts of aircraft, like aircraft frames and engines, that type of thing. Again, fatal defects if you get an incorrect serial number. So if you've got the serial number as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you register 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, fatal. With a motor vehicle, for example, an incorrect identifier, you may put down by mistake the chassis number rather than the vehicle identification number, the VIN. And if that's the case, again, you're in trouble. So we talk about commercial or consumer. Effectively, commercial, of course, is anything that's held in the course or furthering of carrying on of a business to which an ABN has been allocated, and that, for most of us, will be the category. Consumer, that, of course, is goods, etc., that's held by an individual for private use only.
So, Terry, you mentioned PIMSIs before. Do you mind running us through the registration rules for PIMSIs?
Okay, this PIMSIs, as I said before, this is the golden goose. If you register as a PIMSI, great. However, if you've got a PIMSI, you've got to make sure you've got one for starters. And if you've got one, you've got to tick the PIMSI box and you've got to register within the timeframes we discussed earlier. If you don't have a PIMSI and it's registered as a PIMSI, this is a fatal defect. So check the nature of your security interest to confirm whether or not you have a PIMSI. So the sorts of things that PIMSIs are: hire purchase, retention of title, an interest of a lessee under a PPS lease, the interest of a consignor, and of course where finance is being provided to purchase equipment. And of course a sale and a leaseback is not a PIMSI. Just remember, go back to the definition of PIMSIs. Of course it stands for purchase money security interest. And the principle is that if you have effectively provided finance for your customer to buy your product, then it's not equitable that in an insolvency event, if you registered as a PIMSI, that you would be denied because the business would not have the benefit of your asset had you not provided that credit for them. However, you've got to make sure what you've got is a PIMSI. So the tip is this: check the wording of your terms and conditions. Sorry, let's just go back. It did just occur to me there is another less obvious defect that could be, namely not registering in a manner that your terms allow. So check the wording of your terms and conditions to make sure they allow for one single registration for all future supply and don't require a new registration every time you supply.
So, Terry, we've covered fatal defects there. What about potentially fatal defects? What actually makes something a potentially fatal defect?
Okay. There are some defects that are potentially fatal because they may be seriously misleading or they don't comply with the requirements for a financing statement. Seriously misleading isn't defined in the Act and there isn't much guidance, but to give you some ideas: an incorrect secured party details, collateral descriptions, PIMSIs not described as PIMSIs, whether collateral is inventory, whether collateral is subject to any control. So just on collateral, the financing statements need to include a description of the collateral and the proceeds, and the collateral must belong to a single prescribed collateral class. So you've got to pick the appropriate collateral class. There's a free text description box for all classes except for an all PAP, although it's not necessary to complete it. So another tip: if you are going to use the free text box, you need to be careful with the wording and ensure that it covers the collateral and it's not too wide or too narrow. Errors in the free text box could be considered misleading and potentially fatal.
So, Terry, now that we've gone through those potentially fatal defects, what should someone do if they realise there is a potential defect in their registration?
Okay, so if you realise you've got potentially a defect or you haven't registered within time, a remedial registration needs to be made as soon as possible. But if that registration has missed the deadlines, you'll be exposed to vesting and priority risks during that time. Essentially, you're going to need a court order to grant an extension of time for registration. So just remember, the courts can't rectify defects, but they can grant extensions of time. So if any registration is made after other registrations, one other thing you could do is try and get a priority agreement or a release from prior ranking security holders to overcome priority risk. So there's a couple of cases on this. The One Steel case, we won't spend much time on this, but this does give you an example about the consequences of registering against an incorrect grantor So we're talking a tidy sum of $23 million, which was the value of crushing equipment that had been leased to One Steel. The lessor of that equipment registered on the register against the ABN instead of the ACN. What that meant was a search of the ACN would not reveal the registration. So the registration was held to be ineffective, which meant the security interest vested in the administrator. So administrators and liquidators are more than happy to get their hands on as much and as many assets as they can. And in this case, the lessor of $23 million worth of equipment was left not so much holding the baby, but was left with an unsecured claim. Accolade Wines is an example of a case where, somewhat similar, they too had registered against an ABN instead of the ACN. It was inadvertent. When it was discovered, Accolade immediately created new registrations with the correct identifier, but they were out of time. So they went to the court and they sought an extension from the court so that the new registrations would be effective. And of course, they were fortunate that that extension was granted. Accolade, if you don't know, is a very, very large wine company. The chances of that company becoming insolvent were remote. And of course, there were other factors, namely it was confined to a specific collateral class and it didn't affect priorities that the court agreed to extend the time. But although the court was able to grant, here's the message, this would have been a very expensive piece of litigation, not something that anyone would really want to do. So you do need to be careful to get your registrations right in the first place. Okay, so let's have a closer look at the PPSR through PPSR logic. Paul, do you want to walk us through this?
Yeah, thank you, Terry. So we've newly designed a PPSR portal for our customers of CreditorWatch. What we've done is try to make the PPSR experience as simple and as easy to use as possible for customers who may not be up to speed on registering and want a very streamlined process. So we've created templates for our customers, and hopefully that should make it, if a credit manager themselves aren't registering and using their staff to register, they can have that template set up and ready to go as simple as possible. We also make the registration process from new as simple as possible as well. The beauty of our system is we also outline your existing registrations and make the process of amending and discharging those existing registrations simple as well. So, Terry, my next question for you is, what is this January 2019 deadline all about? Where's it come from and why do we care about it so much?
Okay, so the Act commenced in January 2012. Registrations at that time were for a minimum of 7 years, and what that meant was that many businesses registered financing statements for that 7-year period. So at the end of January 2019, that means these registrations are going to start expiring.
All right, we'll just jump into our next poll when that question comes up. And it's really a question around whether or not you have a renewals policy or renewals process in place. I'll bring that up on the screen now for you. All right, we'll give you just a minute or so to answer that. All right, we had an overwhelming response to that question, and it seems that 72% of you actually don't have a policy in place for your renewals, and 28% of you do. So really brings us to our next question. Why do we care so much about the deadline for renewal?
Well, you've probably heard that a security interest must be perfected in order to be effective, often by the registration of a financing statement on the register. So a sort of set and forget thing. But the security interest must not only be perfected by registration, but it's got to be continuously perfected over the life of the security interest. Because if the registration is allowed to expire, there's going to be a gap in perfection, and the validity and priority of your security interest will likely fail. So maintenance of continuous perfection is implicit in an effective registration.
So Terry, January 2019 is almost upon us. What sort of things should our customers be doing now, bearing in mind that 72% of our respondents don't have a policy in place?
Okay. The first thing is to get a PPSR report showing registrations that are due to expire. This should be done as soon as possible. You don't want to run the risk of leaving everything until January 2019. Because at that time, it's expected there's going to be a lot of demand placed on the register. You're also at the end of a holiday period. We all know the country basically closes down for 4 to 6 weeks from Christmas to the end of January. So don't leave it is the big question.
And this is, Terry, this is something that CreditorWatch can help with. We have a number of services that customers can use to help out with this renewal. We can run a report on all of your existing registrations and outline those for you in terms of which is due to expire next. And I guess importantly and coupled with that is the ability to run a data wash on all of those clients to see which ones are actually still trading, highlight for you which ones you in fact are trading with, and assist you with that renewal period or renewal process as well.
Okay, so let's just assume you've done that data wash, you've done that health check, and it shows you've got several, let's just call it 200 registrations about to expire. So I guess the question is, what do you do next? So just bear in mind what we said previously, continuous perfection of the security interest must be retained. So you can do that on the register either by one of three things: renewal, amendment, or a new registration. So renewal is where you change the financing statement to extend the time of the registration only. That's renewal. Amendment is where you change the financing statement end time, just as you did in renewal, but you also take the opportunity to amend other limited aspects of the financing statement, which we'll talk about in a moment. And of course, the other option is a new registration where you lodge a new financing statement on the register in respect of your security interest that's about to expire. So to ensure continuous perfection, you should link the new financing statement to the original financing statement, either by the functionality provided in the registration process or refer to the earlier registration in the collateral description. If you choose to amend your registration, you need to be aware that there are only certain things that can be amended. And we've got a bit of a list there. It's not a fix-all for all your registration. So these are the sorts of things that can be amended. There's a list there that you can go through, but the main things that people would want to amend, we think, would change the end date, add or remove grantors, and maybe look at the free text description. Just as you can amend things, there's always the opposite side of the coin. Here is a list of things that can't be amended. And you might recognise some of those from our discussion on defects. You can't amend things like a PIMSI. You can't amend grantor identifiers. You can't amend serial numbers and collateral type and class. So the benefit of a new registration method is that amendments, while useful, only have legal effect on and from the time they become searchable in the register. And there's also potential for unintended modification of an otherwise valid registration when you attempt to amend. So another takeaway point, keep bearing in mind that the register is a notice board. So what that means is you've got to ensure that anyone searching the notice board or the register is not misled. If a registration lapses, then there's not notice of continuous perfection. And as we said before, the other key takeaway, don't leave this to the last minute. Make sure that any renewal, amendment or new registration is undertaken well before the current registration expires. You can't remedy an expired registration. So here's a quick tip. To be completely covered, you might think about 2 registrations. One to cover your PIMSI, if you have a PIMSI, and one to cover a general security interest over all goods supplied, but not necessarily the specific ones that are characterised as a PIMSI. Now, not everybody does this, but you may want to think about that.
Terry, an issue that gets raised often to me is the question of new or altered terms and conditions, whether or not organisations should do anything about their PPS registrations to go hand in hand with their new terms.
Okay, well, I don't want to sound like a lawyer, but it just depends on the circumstances. So let's quickly have a look at them. First thing to do, have a quick look, have an extensive look at your existing terms for how current they are. So if they're relatively current, is what you need to ascertain. Do they comply with things like the Privacy Act, the unfair contracts regime, and the retention of title clauses? Do they create a security interest that's capable of being registered via a financing statement, and the nature of those clauses themselves? If they're not current, then have a look at what sort of changes you want to make. Are they minor? Do they need a complete review from top to bottom? Let's just say that you want to make some minor changes. So we would see minor changes as mere amendments. So changing contact details in the returns procedure, updating references to legislation. We would say, well, that's not really a brand new contract. These amendments are minor. So you could continue to rely on those existing registrations and only consider whether they are about to expire. And of course, the third thing you can do is, how do your existing terms allow for changes to be made? So have a look at your terms and see what provisions are there that allow you to update or amend your terms from time to time. Of course, the answer to that question may well determine whether or not you're in the brand new contract zone. So if you have a look at your terms, you decide that, wow, these really do need a bit of updating, then just bear in mind that by updating, chances are that a brand new security interest will probably have been created. So that means that a new PPS registration should be made in respect of that new security interest. Likewise, if you intend to make significant and far-reaching amendments to your terms, you'll most likely need to lodge new financing statements for the new security interests that have been created by the acceptance of the new terms. I think the real takeaway point is you should check your terms to consider whether any amendments should be made, check your registrations to consider whether they're defective, and if they are due to expire in January. You could streamline the process by doing everything at the same time, but as I said previously in lawyer speak, that depends on the circumstances.
So Terry, that was a very, very extensive answer to my question. I want to thank you again for attending and providing some good insight into the register. From my perspective, I wanted to have a quick look at what's next in our webinar series. we'll look at PPSR after the registration. So what Terry, yourself and I will go through is everything you need to know once you've registered, including discharging your registrations and dealing with administrators and liquidators. Once again, unfortunately, we've run out of time to answer questions directly on the webinar here, but I'll certainly make sure that any questions that have come through, and there's quite an extensive list, they'll be answered in the next day or so. So thank you again for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thanks very much.
Thank you.